All right. And we are live. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I have with me this evening a gentle person that I met not too long ago. I think it was first met you a couple of months ago. We started chatting. Niddy, of course, had me on their channel, and I extended the favor for Niddy to come on my channel, and we're going to be talking about Christianity and cults, specifically the group that Niddy came from. So we're going to kind of break that down a little bit. Welcome, Niddy. Thanks for joining me this evening.
Yeah, happy to be here. I am super pumped to talk about this stuff and expose people to the wildness, and maybe to hopefully help people kind of think about their own religious experiences and how they talk about their own religious experiences and things like that. We'll see where it goes to.
Absolutely. And I do want to say before we kind of launch into this, and we were kind of talking about this a little bit before the stream started, this can be this is a pretty heavy topic. Now, of course, Niddy is removed from his experience to the extent where he feels comfortable talking about it on a channel like mine. But if any of this stuff resonates with you, if you suspect that you might belong to one of these groups, I do want to suggest that you seek help and counsel for that. And there are resources out there, but we are not here to offer psychological advice. Disclaimer.
Yes, absolutely.
So, Niddy, let's get started. How about you tell us a little bit about who you are, your background, and maybe what got you onto YouTube?
Yeah, so I am known as Nidemos, the animated atheist. That's my channel. People call me Niddy. I like to say at the end of my streams, that's Niddy. And so that's like what my little tagline that's come up. I call my regular viewers part of the Niddyverse. I have my own cultish language associated with my little community of people that hang out with me. But I grew up. I won't go too deep in the background yet, but grew up not really Christian, became a Christian, was involved in a non-denominational church for about 12 and a half years, and kind of deconverted from that. And I really aspired to be a leader in that group. And I'll kind of talk about why that is in your next question. But so I've gone through a lot of theological training and a lot of thinking. And I am a husband and a dad and a full-time, web developer. And I decided to take to YouTube because I see that in our culture and in our online space, there is a lot of non-believing activism against things like Jehovah's Witness and Mormonism, but there's not too many voices speaking out against high control non-denominational groups. And there are even fewer voices kind of exploring that kind of cult, just in general, the cultish language that happens throughout the laity of these kind of like every member ministry churches or things like that, and kind of the predatoriness of some kinds of small groups. And in addition to that, there's a few voices kind of merging the deconversion process with like the ancient Near East and the things that you kind of learn from reading those kinds of texts. And also, there aren't too many voices being a bit meta about the deconversion experience, right? Like, what are the kinds of feelings that you have as you're confronted with information that kind of contradicts, what you thought before, or actual evidence to the contrary of something that you deeply held as true? And so that's why I took to YouTube to call out, the cultiness and the high controlness of the group that I was a part of, to kind of get meta about the deconversion stuff. And then I love to be an asset and a voice in the community, in the side chats, and in the open panels and things like that, to let people be heard, seen, and just ask me questions and see if I'm still wrong. Maybe God's still there and I'm really screwing this whole thing up, and maybe someone on YouTube will show me something I've never seen before. Keeping myself open.
Right. And if you can't tell, Niddy's a really nice, open, kind of genuine person. But
I don't have two personas like a lot of YouTubers.
Right.
The Niddy you see on the camera, I'm like the same doofus like everywhere. So
I wouldn't say doofus, but yes, genuine
okay.
is what I'll go with.
Yeah.
So let's start to unpack this a little bit, your religious background. And you mentioned high control groups. And I do want to come back to that, because you're kind of hitting on kind of the hallmark feature of cults, which is kind of authoritarianism. I mean, to put it bluntly, right? So tell us about your religious background, kind of what brought you to religion, and then from there, maybe get into a little bit of what got you involved with the particular group that you were involved with.
Absolutely. So I grew up as a as a child, I was just a agnostic theist, I guess, until like middle adolescence, where my mom just kind of drugged me to church whenever it was most convenient for her, especially at like Christmas and Easter. So I was functionally a creaster, as we would call that in the church. Your Christmas, Easter Christian. Or, we'd go to like particular religious rites, RITE type events, like baptisms and funerals and things like that. So it was never like something that was like a highly emphasized thing. It was like, this is just something that we do for community or to hear about God, whatever. And then I had some traumatic types of experiences as a young teen, and some social difficulties and mental issues and social issues and financial issues in my family that made me really doubt that, and that God existed, rather. And I was kind of angry that if God existed, why would he let all this stuff happen to me? The basic problem of evil for teenagers, right? It's very juvenile, I'll admit that, and so I went through high school just non-believing, not really going to church, whatever. And then I actually got a scholarship to go to a Christian-based college, where I went to a Mennonite school that gave me a half-ride scholarship.
Really?
Because, my grades were pretty good, and that Mennonite school was hurting for attendance, so why not? And so I'll take a half ride. Why not? And Mennonites seem decent. And so I went to that school, and part of going to that Mennonite college, I had to take like a history of Christianity class, attend a couple mandatory like religious things, take an intro to biblical literature class. And so I learned, the basic outline of the Bible, what some of the earliest church fathers, the ante-Nicene and Nicene fathers thought about it. And then like, how did we get to being Protestant, and what was like the origins of the Mennonites and stuff like that. And then I wrote the most bullshit, Gish Gallopy intro to biblical literature paper I've ever read in my life. I'm like, this is the most wishy-washy progressive Christian thing ever, but they gave me a decent grade on it because I tried, like it was so. I went back and read it. That's how I know that. So I was at that college for 4 years. I even did a Christian missionary activity for 6 months in Pittsburgh, where I worked with inner city youth. And the whole program was based on Romans 12, 1 and 2, which ironically is part of like the Byte Model in a way, where it's therefore, in view of God's mercy and sacrifice, offer yourselves as living sacrifices, holy, an offering holy and pleasing to God. Do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may test and approve what God's will is, his good, perfect, and pleasing will. And so the reason we use those verses in that inner city ministry was to try and give these kids a vision of another way to live, right? Something that's positive and productive and not based on everything else, the world that's going on around, the hood, right? That's going on around you in the city. And that experience played a little bit in towards giving me a positive spin on Christianity, right? That Christianity can give you a positive vision for your future or something like that. Maybe that was in my subconscious, right? So I wasn't totally like, screw you, Jesus. Like, I don't want to have anything to do with you, right? And so I got out of college, and, it's 2008, the recession, just poof, no jobs, right? And so I was hunting for jobs. I got a job at like Panera Bread and was working with a Christian guy whose dad was a pastor of a church. And we got to being friends and stuff and played Magic the Gathering together.
Nice.
And he tried to really pull me to church and things like that. And so I started checking out a church when I ran into this other girl after going to the bar one night. And she stops me on the staircase and she says, "Are you a believer?" And I'm like, "In what? Like, what does that have to do with any, like, what, a believer in what? Like shoes? Like, what do you want from me?" She's like, "In Jesus." So I'm like, oh. We're having that conversation. No. And she's like, okay. So she got me to go to this like community centered church with like college age, young professional age people.
Yeah.
And I was checking that out. And then, I remember crying in the pastor's arms because I felt like I was addicted to porn and stuff, and going to their home groups and things like that. But I still didn't really believe it or like care that deeply about it. Like I was really interested in it because the people were interested in me, but not because of the content of it, if that makes sense. And so they convinced me to like pray for a job, right? Because Panera is like meh. So they're like, pray for a job, pray that God, reveals himself to you and gives you a job. I'm like, oh yeah, I'll do that. So I prayed for a job, and I went to this interview in Columbus, Ohio, and I got a job, and I moved to Columbus away from all that community and all those people and stuff. And I got really depressed, right? Living alone, removed from all these people who just started to get invested in me, right? And so obviously that'll bring you a little depression. And I remember posting like something like, maybe God is seeking me out like a raptor or something like that. And my friend messaged me on Gmail and was like, "Hey, why don't you check out this home Bible study group that's meeting in Columbus, Ohio? Why don't you check that out?" I met them, on my New Orleans mission trip. They seem cool. And so I started checking out this group. And the first thing I see when I walk up the stairs of this like Ohio State campus group was this guy in all black leather, like trench coat type thing, and a black leather hat, smoking a cigarette. And I'm like, I can fit in here. These might be my people, right?
Nice.
Freaky deaky, a little weird, quirky and stuff. And yeah, sure enough, there were some very weird people there. And I remember saying things like, I think God brought me here. This is just such an amazing thing to see all these people who really care about this, who are my age, who seem intellectually invested in this and know their stuff. They're just not talking out their ass. They like, if I have a question about the Bible, they're just like on it. They just know, right? And people were taking a genuine interest in me, or it seemed like a genuine interest in me. And then after a couple months of going to that on like a regular basis, I had been listening to the Bible from them, and I ended up going to like another teaching that they had. And they would try to like plan to do fun things with me, get coffee, and ask me to read the Bible. And I remember us reading Romans 1 together, and they're like, what's that talking about? And I remember saying something like, it's talking about like the hypocrites on like Fox News and stuff like that. Like, it's really like trite, immature, like stereotypical liberal thing to say, right? Against like the Bible, right? Like, oh, it's against hypocrites like these guys over here, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So over the summer, though, I got more and more involved, and they seemed to take an interest in like my DJing and wanted me to like bring over my DJ stuff and do stuff with that. And I was kind of propositioned in the living room of one of these campus houses, like, hey, what do you think about the idea of like really starting that relationship with God, right? That's like the language we would use around it. And the teaching was on like First Timothy, right? And so I was a person who ran around with like a lot of guilt, a lot of shame, a lot of feeling unaccepted throughout my life. But here it's all being propositioned as you're going to have this ultimate acceptance. You're going to have this ultimate value. And it's going to be the best thing ever. That's going to change your life, And the passage was 1 Timothy 1, 15, 16, where it's like, hey, if God can forgive Paul for being such a mess, he can forgive you, right? It's just the general gist of that. And I remember being like, okay, God, if you're there, you love me, blah, 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 forgive me, come into my life, come my heart. And I remember crying, and going to sleep and having this great night's sleep because I have the thing that we've been talking about for months that I desperately apparently needed. This eternal security, all this love, all this acceptance. It's never going to go away now. I'm forever sealed in heaven, right? That's how we would kind of talk about it. And then after I made that decision, things changed a little bit, but I didn't know it at first. But things didn't just change with me. Things changed with everyone else. Because once I made that decision in front of everyone else and everyone had been aware that I was now with Jesus or whatever, they changed their dynamics in relating to me. Well, now he can come to this other group. Now he gets let's ask him to come to prayer group. Let's ask him to come to our men's group. Let's ask him to do this and that. Let's ask him to read the Bible one-on-one with somebody. And like when those kinds of dynamics shift and you get even more acceptance and affirmation, it pulls you in deeper, right? It's kind of like a rip current. That's when you hit the rip current, right? And you're just in the rip current and you're getting pulled along with what the group is trying to do with you, but you don't realize it because you have you're just a rush of emotions, right? You're a rush of new experiences that you've never felt this way before. You've never been in this type of life situation before. And it's just pulling you down deeper into whatever is being asked of you pretty much. And you've given so much time and effort and thought, and you're experiencing so many good things that you don't really think about it too much more after that. You're just like, oh yeah, this is what we do now. I go to this meeting this time a week. I go to that meeting that time a week. Then I go to that one and then that one.
So
and that's how it kind of started to play out for the first 2 years, right? I just started getting more and more involved. And then they're like, why don't you take this spiritual class? Oh yeah, Jesus saved me. I could give him some money and some time to take a class. Yeah. And so I took a spiritual class, right? Intro to the Bible, which was, hey, Stephanie, which was, like a 6-week class, 2 hours a night on Wednesdays for like 6 weeks. And then they're like, okay, you did that. Why don't you take Christian Growth? And then Christian Growth 2. All right, why don't you meet with someone regularly to study the Bible with them? And so I just kept getting more and more and more involved. And it's all framed like that means you're growing spiritually. That means like, when you're ready to do this and step out in faith and do this new thing, that's real growth. That's God changing your heart, right? And he wants to bear fruit through you. So you've got to take these classes. You've got to start meeting with people regularly. And maybe one day you too will teach men's group. It's only a few classes and some more discipleship relationships away. Maybe you too will one day lead a home church, and God will be blessing your ministry through. It's just a few more classes after that away. Right? You see how
Yeah.
I'm framing it a little bit, right? I'm
Yes.
specifically
Yes.
talking in a way that makes it sound a bit more pyramid schemey, right? But it's not talked about that way in the in-group, right? It's
Right.
this is all acts of God blessing you, driving you towards this fruit bearing, this leadership role. And
So,
so that's how I
yeah.
got to eventually being a home church stand-in teacher. So I'm familiar with the Bible back to front, despite what many Christians in my chat think. I'm familiar with lots of different doctrines, lots of different apologetics. I used to lead a men's group. I've studied with people day and night on the Bible. Now, I don't know Koine Greek in depth or Aramaic or Hebrew, but I like to know that I can at least play ball with most apologists.
Let's take a. I want to take a small step back
Yeah.
because now most of the people that are listening right now are probably familiar with some of the lingo and the jargon that you've
Mm-hmm.
used. But like some of my students aren't necessarily from a Christian or even an American background, and
Right.
it's like 1.5% of my YouTube audience is from India for some reason. So they may not be as familiar with um, how what you're describing within standard American Christianity might be a little odd. So if you
Yeah.
could
Yeah.
kind of compare and contrast, like
Mm-hmm.
maybe what your experience with the church was like prior to this group, and then how this group may be uh, distinct from other like
Absolutely.
mainline denominations.
Yeah. So let's kind of start with the most fundamentally worldwide version of Christianity, which is like Catholicism, right? How is my group different than Catholicism? Well, in most instances of Catholicism, you're primarily dealing with people who are concerned with going to Mass, going to confession, performing some rituals around Lent and Easter, and being baptized. So my church experience is similar in that we didn't have Mass, right? We didn't say anything was required even. We believe that you would generally be saved by your faith and trust relationship with Jesus Christ. That works were independent of that. But the more works you do is evidence of growth in your spirit, or growth in your relationship to Christ. You would want to get baptized in obedience to Jesus Christ, because he said, "Go forth and baptize people in my name, and I'll always be with you." Um, you would confess your sins to one another, not to a priest, but to one another, because we're all priests in the new covenant. You would, you know, give things up for Jesus because out of just obedience to him. You didn't need Lent or anything like that. So that's how it kind of differed from Catholic. Oh, and we didn't have like a pope or central authority or anything like that. Typical Protestant interpretations of the New Testament and its leadership. Now, how we kind of differ from, let's say, like Baptists, Presbyterians, and Mennonites, is that we don't have like bishops, priests, or districts or anything like that, or like a convention that meets. This non-denominational church is kind of an organism unto itself, where there's like a body of what they call elders that are overseers over groups of churches, and then there's elders that are just overseers over singular home groups of churches, and that's what makes up this kind of non-denominational movement. And so I hope that kind of framed. Oh, and I guess the mentality is not that you basically ought to go on Sunday or Saturday or any particular day. It's that you're in community with your home group. That's the emphasis. And so that's where this kind of group tries to convince you is what's most important, and then the large group meeting where you're more anonymous and it's kind of like a bigger social setting is not really emphasized as heavily. So that, which is actually a big difference to most mainline denominations in America.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, thanks. That was, I think that clarified what I was asking there. So let's go back. You're getting more involved in the group.
Mm-hmm.
You're being invited to these classes.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you say classes, is it kind of, from how you were framing it, it sounds very small, maybe you and a few other people. Are you having to pay money for these classes? Are you expected to like volunteer more of your time?
Yeah. So basically, there's a set of classes which are generally geared towards like the curious and or bored. So if you want to learn about the book of Ezekiel, you pay like $15 and you go learn about the book of Ezekiel. Fine, for a couple weeks. If you want to grow in your faith, there's cheap, air quotes this for college students, right? Cheap classes to learn the basics, according to Protestants, of Christianity, right? Intro to the Bible, or, intro to Christianity. And those are just like 4 or 5, 6 week classes, but they're only like an hour or two. So it's like, nothing too nefarious or weird about that, right? You'd kind of like not really balk too much if your friend like joined a yoga class where they learned, like particular breathing exercises or prayers or whatever. You just be like, okay, whatever. Like that's basically what that is, just with a little bit of Bible mixed into it, right? But then everything after that goes beyond the curious level, where the community, especially like the 18 to 25-year-olds are in this particular thing, what they'll do is they'll position the classes after that as kind of a must, or as like a marker of like your faith commitment, right? Where it's like, I really think you should take Christian growth. Are you willing to take a step of faith and offer up some of your time to understand more deeply how to relate to God? I'll take it with you. Right? And so there's a bit of coercion happening there to take this more expensive, longer class to understand more of the Bible and get you to reshape your thinking to be more in line with the rest of how they think about the Bible and how they kind of perceive what it means to be sanctified or be more usable to Jesus. And then if you dug that, if you're showing signs that like, oh yeah, I really liked learning all that stuff, and I like, the stuff that I'm talking about, and I want to help other people learn it too, then they'll be like, oh yeah, you want to take Christian ministry? Okay, all right. Yeah, you take Christian ministry, and that's where they're doing their equipping so that you can fight the battle with the church and become a leader one day, right? They cast this vision of greatness for you because you showed this little bit of willingness here. Let's add a little more. And people keep saying sugar cubes and honey in the chat. It's basically that. It's this is like little, it's a sugar cube of like, look how awesome you could be. You want to lick some more? Just take the next one.
It's all Bree's fault.
Yeah. But it is similar to that. Yeah. And there is a money aspect. Yeah. So the classes for adults not in the college ministry have a threefold cost to what the college student pays, which is still very cheap for how many weeks you are in a lot of these classes. However, when you multiply that out by how many people usually take the classes, they are making about $1,000 at least a class. At least is what I will be very generous to say. And so, yeah, and they'll do that 4 times a year for different branches of these kinds of leadership training classes.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's, if I'm interpreting Darren's question correctly here, that's kind of the follow-up question I had.
Yeah.
Because Yeah,
Which,
go
by the
ahead.
way, you can also not attend the later leadership classes unless you're giving 3 to 5% of your income.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah,
Okay.
there's a different paywall that's not discussed to the public. To become like a servant leader in the church, you have to at least be giving 5, if not 7%, I think is the number of your income.
Yeah, that was kind of and that's kind of what I got from Darren's question as well.
Yeah.
Because, it's one thing to religiously associate it or not. It's one thing to be a part of a book study, and it's like, hey, the book's $30, and maybe you throw in $5 a week for pretzels while we're talking or something like that. But
Right.
it sounds like, from what you're describing, they had classes geared towards college age students that were understandably cheap. And then once you got like younger adults / professionally established adults, then we increase it a little bit. But then you're saying, to be in that upper echelon, the leadership classes, there's these other commitments. And I was going to ask you about, like, perhaps maybe not monetary, but usually how this thing goes is also like time commitments.
Yes. So in order to be considered, because the home church has to be, when I say home church, think of like 10 to 30 people in your community, led by about 4 to 6 leaders, right? Who are doing most of the discipling and teaching amongst that small community. The leaders have to basically approve your involvement in Christian ministry, or what's called leadership training class, right? So you don't get to take that class if the leaders don't think that you are going to be a leader either. And the reason they'll do that is because they want you to be, going to what's called home church every week, which is at least 2 to 3 hours of your involvement. They want you to be going to central teaching every week, which is not just going to the big meeting, but also some kind of hangout either before or afterwards. So that can be another 4 hours. So we're at 6 minimum hours. And then the next thing you have to go to is like the men's or women's group, which is at least 3 more hours. So there's 9 hours of your week. And then in order to be considered for a leadership training class, you have to be leading someone individually. So you have to be doing some kind of what's called a discipleship relationship. So that can be 1 or 2 more hours of your week, not counting any prep time you might be doing for that. So we're looking at least 12 hours of your week has to go to the church. And that's like a bare minimum, absolute bare minimum. So if you're working a full-time job, 12 more hours is work. It's not even like, part of it too is like this is supposed to be like a sacrifice, right? Or like, and that's minimum, right? And if you don't really hang out that much or hang out very long with the group, you might even get admonished for that or challenged for that and be like, hey, why aren't you really investing yourself here? So 12 hours, I think, is like considered like barely able, I think, to get into the leadership training class. A 20-hour a week person, now that person, they want to give it all for Jesus. We got to let them lead some stuff, right? So now we're talking 60 hours.
Wow.
Plus your job, plus your church stuff. Yeah.
Right. On top of your life, your job, your kids, your family.
Oh, let's not even count if you're married or dating or in school, for crying out loud.
Right. So you're at this point of the narrative, you're kind of fully invested. You're going to these classes, you're kind of being roped further and further, groomed. At what point did you start to think that something might be off here, or that something smelled a little fishy, or that you were uncomfortable? Was it that you were uncomfortable with a particular situation?
Just one point, actually. It was multiple. Okay. So like, here's the interesting thing, I think, that happens. And it's kind of, I'm going to be real meta here for a second. When I watch kind of YouTube Christians who are the age I was when I was real deep in it, like there was a time where I was so personally convinced and being told maybe this isn't, something that's true, or it's a bit culty, that in one ear out the other. And I think it's partly a product of what you get out of being committed and being in that kind of thought space and community that basically acts as like Iron Man armor. Like shit can just bounce off you. You're just like, yeah, whatever. I'm young. I'm invincible. I believe what I believe, and it's true, bitch. Like, I'm gonna fly around with my laser blasters and be like, Jesus is real. Like, fuck you. I'm sorry, I don't know how your language is on your chat on your channel, but
Right.
it really is like that. You think you're like Tony Stark up in here with your apologetics, and you're flying around like you neutralizing the atheists, right, and the skeptics and the people who are accusing you of being a cult. Like you've got Invinso Jesus armor on, and like. It's when you get a little bit older and dealing with more adults and you have more dissonance and space and time to like think about things on a more serious level rather than just relying on the people older than you or like some other scholar over here or this scholar over there or whatever who's got more letters after their name than you. When you're less like, well, maybe I should actually kind of question their perspective, right? When you're able to take that step back. So early on, even not long after I became a Christian, I tried to talk to my atheist coworker. And he's like, oh God, what cult did you get into? And I was like, oh no. And then I found William Lane Craig and I was good for like 3 years. And then I tried to reach out to someone else at work and it was successful. And like they came to my group and they joined up and I was able to teach them the Bible for a while. But their parents were like super like, what the fuck is going on with my son? And they were like, yo, buddy, we think you're in a cult. And like they kept talking with him about it. And like I remember, crying with him and like trying to convince him like, no, we're not really a cult, blah, 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 blah. And it was really difficult because it was just constantly putting a strain on our friendship and his own mental health. And he eventually just up and left one day. And I didn't think much about it because I had a narrative and a way to construct his leaving that seemed completely legitimate. Like if he was willing to leave us, he was never for us, right? Or like there's all kinds of things that Christians can do to frame it so that it's actually he's the one that's being evil or deceived or isn't as committed or faithful to Jesus, right? There's nothing wrong with what I'm doing, right? It's them, it's you, not me kind of mentality. And then, later again, reaching out to coworkers. Hey, I've had a lot of friends who came to your church and said it was really fucked up. Like, what's going on with that? And being like, no, we're not a cult. Like, it's all voluntary, guys. Come on. That's like basically kind of the apologetics or they had bad experiences. I get that. We're all sinners, I've maybe messed up too, but you know what? That's not my overall experience. Right. This really kind of like dismissive type of survivorship bias response.
Okay, because that was another question I was going to ask you. While you were deeply involved with the group, if you ever had any close friends, sound like you had some co-workers, any family members that came to you and said like, hey, Niddy, I noticed that you're spending 20 hours a week. Did those sorts of conversations happen? And if so, how were they handled? I'm guessing you kind of dismissed them.
Yeah, 1 second.
No worries. While we're waiting on Niddy's response, Bree, we're not answering your question. Well, go ahead, Niddy. Bree's got a question for you.
Who does Niddy pick when playing Mario Kart? Did leaving the group impact his choice? No, I think I like just always pick Yoshi. I just pick Yoshi. Nice. That's just my pick.
I'm a Wario type person,
yeah. Oh yeah. No. So yeah, it didn't affect a thing. I was wearing a Mario shirt yesterday actually, with Wario, Waluigi, Mario, and Luigi on it. But anyway, so yeah, my mom was at first pretty concerned, but I didn't think much of it because she was predominantly Catholic up until that point, and I actually basically drew her to be more non-denominational, which is fun. And then, did I have any other close friends? So the friends, I think that whole moving away experience really did remove me from a lot of the closer friends that I had or could have had. And so I was already just kind of isolated. And I was in a vulnerable position that made it easier to kind of get sponged up into that group. Though it did pull me away from pursuing becoming like a traveling electro house rave DJ. So
what?
Yeah,
this would have been a completely different conversation if that would happen.
It wouldn't have happened. I mean, I don't think I'd be on YouTube. Well, I'd be on YouTube, but in my DJ form, DJ Nick's Phonic.
Be too cool to talk to me, probably. Not that you're not cool now, right?
Oh, thanks.
So where did the cracks start to appear for you? Where did it start to fall apart?
Yeah, it was a combination of two kind of worldwide events, I'd say. One was the pandemic. So like the pandemic, when I said that it's really important for people in high commitment groups or anything like that to get space to slow down and think about the foundations of why it is they're doing all the things that they're doing. That's what helped me kind of step away and think more deeply about like, okay, what is this stuff that I really believe? Why am I so committed to this? You know, is this a product of something in my psychology? Things like that. So freaking Dr. Josh. But
hey, Dr. Josh.
So I started to doubt towards the middle of, we'll call it the middle, right, of the pandemic, late 2020. Is there like a Holy Spirit like indwelling me, right? Is there this supervening intelligence that's trying to talk to me to do one decision or another, right? And I didn't feel that. I didn't have a sense of that. And through my connections on YouTube to Act 17 Apologetics, David Wood, and I think it's like Apologetics Squared, the algorithm started recommending things to me like Apologia and Telltale Atheist. And through even my non-denominational group, we were all for being engaged in the culture, engaged in the discourse, but also not being complete and utter bigots. I like to say that the church I was involved in were a bunch of fundies that didn't like to be called fundies. So we wanted to convert LGBTQ people to Christianity, but at the cost of their sense of identity, right? Or so we would do everything in our power to be like around these kinds of people, but then, you know, basically try to do some kind of soft conversion therapy on them. But anyway, we were trying to be as unoppositional to the world around us as possible, right? So we'd have a Game of Thrones watch party, a Walking Dead watch party, and think nothing of it, right? But we're really deep down committed Christians, right? And so being able to see other people who genuinely believe that they have the Holy Spirit say things that I completely disagree with, that were oppositional to the culture, that were completely different from how I do church, from how I understand the Bible. These people are completely convinced that they have the Holy Spirit, that God is speaking directly to them, something I've never experienced on like Owen's channel, Telltale. I'm like, what the hell is with that? Like, where is this experience in my life? And it started to make me really depressed because I'm watching Christians around me start to get sucked into kind of like the Trump cult too. Like some people in my church are like kind of Trump sycophants in a way. but just enough to still want to be in my church. It's really weird. Frankly, it's bizarre. But and then I had like a major depressive episode at the beginning of 2021, which made me go, okay, like I'm not even sure any of this is real. And then January 6th happened, right? 2021. Oh, yeah. And what I realized then was that one of the strongest apologetic arguments for Christianity is this shit's too early to be a legend, guys. Right? It's the attestation of Jesus rising from the dead. It's just 10, 20, 30 years from the event. So early, guys. So we have to believe it's true because that's so early. Well, why are people marching on the Capitol? They think the election is stolen. Well, I sure as fuck don't. It's been 2 months. Wait, humans believe something completely absurd in 2 months? Because so-and-so said so? Because there's no facts to back it up? Why do I have the credulity for 2,000 years ago, people believing something 10 years, 20 years removed from the events, but I don't have the credulity to believe something 2 months removed from the events? What's going on here? Why am I holding two different standards for these things? And as soon as that I realized that, I'm like, I need to reinvestigate every damn thing in this Bible.
Was it, this is interesting. So was it people in leadership positions, or were you under the impression that the people that you were having these conversations with, that kind of spiritually
conversations with mostly, yeah.
So spiritually, metaphysically, theologically speaking, you believed and they believed that, you know, y'all were reading the Bible together, y'all were perhaps having these communal religious experiences together, and then they were saying stuff that for you there's some cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, exactly.
That's kind of okay.
It's like what they're saying could be in concert or agreement with these other people over here that I definitely disagree with, right? And yet we ought to be one in the spirit. We ought to be reaching the same conclusions about reality, and we just aren't, right? And how, like, what's the evidence that's convincing them otherwise? And how long is it taking for that evidence to be gathered? And what are the standards of that evidence? And we're holding these incredibly high standards for like the sanctity of how we conduct culture and politics and the economy and all this shit. But we don't have that same kind of standard for how we direct our entire lives based on this book that's 2,000 years old, right? It's significantly lower, right? Because we're going on the authority of the authority of the authority of the authority of, and we have to get in our damn time machine to validate it at this point, right? And so the dissonance of that, looking back through the evidence for like the Exodus, looking at the critiques of the philosophy of belief, really helped me deconstruct all of that and step away long enough to say, okay, maybe this isn't worth believing. And then it took me a long time to be convinced to not be worried about like hell or other stuff like that.
Right.
And I think another dissonance driving experience was that summer of 2021, I was talking with a guy that I had been relating to for like the last 6.5 years at that point. And I'm like, man, I still want to come out to this group, but I'm going through a lot of doubts right now. I don't know. I don't think any of this is really true, but I want to be in relationship with my family. I want to know what my kids are learning, who they're around. I want to be a part. I want to be friends with you guys, but I'm just not sure any of this is true. And he just basically looked me in the eyes, was like, you know, why are you even here then? If you don't think it's true, why are you even here? And he's like, I'm worried about you. I'm like, why? He's like, I think you're going to be sick until you get to heaven. And I'm just like, I'm trying to get well, according to you. I'm still hearing Jesus, according to you. I'm still sitting under your Bible, according to you. Is that not good enough for you? apparently not. And I remember teaching the same thing. So, he's just flying from that same seat of his pants of, if it's not true, just fuck off and do whatever, But that introduced a lot more dissonance for me because I realized that there's something going on here with the ideology that is more important than the person, that is more important than the people. Something about the sanctity of this set of beliefs and protecting it is more important than anyone or anything else. And that can all be sacrificed at any moment in the name of that set of ideas.
So Niddy and I had a conversation through DMs and before the stream started. We wanted to kind of go through, it's called the Byte Model. This is put together based off of a lot of research that's been done on cults and new religious movements over the past 50 years or so. It really started with the studies of re-education camps that were happening in China during the Cold War, and of course the new religious movements and cults of the 60s kind of kicked off the academic study of these groups. And the Byte Model is an indicator. It's a list of questions, and depending upon how you answer these questions, there's a lot of red flags that ought to be, depending on how you're answering these questions, would give you a good indication of whether or not you're in a cult. So I'm going to share my screen. There's 4 general categories, and Niddy, you just jump in here whenever you're ready. But this is based off of what's referred to as authoritarian control, authoritarian groups. So first and foremost, these are groups that are controlled and led by a strong leader who controls different aspects of the individual's life. We have 4 general categories: behavioral control, information control, thought control.
Where I do need to pause you, though, because what's weird about this church in particular that I was a part of is that it lacks that. It lacks a central worshipped leader to disseminate the decision making, right? Or to exercise their particular control over anyone. What's fascinating and what's interesting is if you go and watch a channel like Theremin Trees, he talks about how people can be deputized, or how like the Jehovah's Witness basically deputizes people to be these kinds of charismatic leaders who enact these kinds of methods in order to keep the members deeply invested. And so the emphasis on the home group model actually creates what I'd like to kind of frame as like a micro cult, right? You have the person who led you to Christ, who is kind of your spiritual father or mother, who helped birth you into this new identity that you have, being in relationship to God. And so they're able to do these kinds of things or frame things in these kinds of ways because that authority is basically baked into how we talk about what we believe, why we believe it, and what's going on, and the relationship dynamics that are built within it. And so I think that gets missed a lot in these kinds of discussions because, and that's where our culture kind of talks past a group like this, where they go, but we don't have a central leader, so we're not a cult. It fails at the first point, so we're out of here, guys. Discussion over. It's like, nah, bitch. Let's get back here. We got to talk through the rest of this list here.
So although you didn't necessarily have a central leader, what you're saying is the framework that was provided kind of sets it up for that?
Yeah, it sets you up to become that leader for someone else.
Gotcha. So let's start with behavioral control. broadly speaking, in the group that you belong to, what were some behavioral control that you noticed or that stood out to you?
Make this full screen so I can see better. Okay. So, okay. Number 2, when you're in the college ministry in particular, one of the things that will happen is that you exit high school, or you're exiting high school, and you've been involved in their high school ministry for a while. And as a, potential college group home church leader, I would position this to young adults as, why don't you take this step of faith and move into the ministry house?
Oh,
And
okay.
that is a community of anywhere from like 7 or 8 to about a dozen of people. By the way, in like a 4 to 5 person house of your home group or whatever. And the people who don't move in the ministry house are typically given less discipleship priority, less opportunities, less emphasis, less invites to things, because they haven't taken that step of faith yet, right? So we're not telling you have to live in the ministry house, but if you do, you're really showing spiritual growth. It's
Gotcha.
coercion. And
Niddy,
and the rent is like a third of what it would be living on your own. So
Niddy, we have a quick question here. How large was the group that you belong to?
So my home groups varied. So the home groups themselves were like, I think our smallest home group was ever 20, and our largest was like about 48 people before we split. And then that's another term that's loaded for us anyway. And then the sphere, which is a group of home groups, would be about 500-600 people. And then the church overall is about 5,000. Maybe 6, 7. I don't know the current numbers.
Okay.
So it's pretty big. But the reason it doesn't seem big when you're in it, we're the inverse of many Protestant churches in America, where their emphasis is on the big church, and then they offer small group, right? That's not how this works. This is small groups that become the big group.
What other behavioral controls did you notice?
Sleep deprivation is kind of incidental. So you end up as a young person just staying up really, really late, having these deep philosophical and theological discussions. Financial exploitation and dependence, yes, because again, you're not only incentivized to live in the subsidized housing experience, but you're also disincentivized from working a job on top of your schooling, because you've got home church, you've got cell group, you've got central teaching. Remember, that's like 10 hours of stuff. So imagine trying to be in your classes, which is probably like 17 credit hours, 10 hours of Bible study stuff. Where's your study time? And then how are you going to get a job?
Right.
That makes a meaningful income? You won't. And if you try, you might get rebuked for it, because you want to store up treasures in heaven, not on this earth, right? So if you devote more time to studies, you're shitted. If you devote more time to work, you're poo-pooed. And lo and behold, and then where's your family come in? Where's having fun, right? Being a normal 18 to 26-year-old, like, where the hell is all that? So that's worth number 8: restrict entertainment, leisure, and vacation time. God forbid you take a vacation outside the group, because again, that's an earthly treasure, not a treasure in heaven. You might be spending too much money on concerts if you don't have money to give to the church.
Were people shamed for decisions that were made like that?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Totally.
Like ostracized, or was it like a sit down, like with a one-on-one with the pastor, and he kind of scolded you type
It would be
thing?
like your home group leader, your discipler would be encouraged to be like, hey, do you think it's really valuable that you spend so much time online gaming, buddy? Or like, why don't you? I've noticed that you've been cutting back on your after CT time. What's with that? You know, um, yeah. So it'd be social rewards and punishments, right?
Okay.
Or like permission required for major decisions. Yeah. So if like you wanted to take a job that interfered with one of the major meetings, like one of those big three meetings of home church, central teaching, or cell group, the gender-based study groups, if you wanted to take a job that could interfere with that, you would be punished for that. It'd be like,
Really?
well, yeah, it'd be like you're not as committed. You know, we don't know if you should still be in the ministry house if you want to work that job.
Wow.
Yeah, so your living situation could become under threat. Um, and you're 18 to 26. You're 18 to 26. You just got out of your parents' house and you're trying to establish yourself. And here you go, like your very living situation can become under threat just based on a manager who doesn't give a fuck and just needs to give you a couple more hours. Like, what's with that? You know, isn't Jesus more flexible than a 9 to 5? I mean, come on. Yeah, instill dependency and obedience, totally.
Right. Right. These
But
are.
now
Yeah,
here's
go
the
ahead.
thing. When you're from the outside coming into the group, you aren't raised into it. I think this is partly incidental because this language and way of framing these life decisions is so normalized in this group that you don't see that for what it is. That you're just like, this is just how we talk. This should be the normal because this is how we are relating to God. Thankfully, the more serious stuff that you can go to jail for, we didn't do that stuff usually. Now, I never did any of that stuff, but there were some abuses that happened on a punitive and criminal level. But yeah, separation of families kinds of is like an incidental thing, right? Where it's like outside of holidays, going home every weekend would be frowned upon, right? To see
Okay.
your family, even if they're in town, because it's like you're missing out on core relational time to the people that Jesus has placed you with in this house, right? You're hardly here, is what we would kind of say. So again, another punishment, right? Or an indictment of their character or ability to commit themselves to what we're doing.
Right. What about information control?
So I think this is actually incidental of it's both incidental and by design of certain Christian groups and throughout my experience and in America, where to the people who have higher levels of scholarship about the New Testament, um, you distort the historical record of things like the gospel accounts, what the earliest actual evidence is for Christianity, and you make it sound way better than it actually is. You withhold the similarities in religious culture of the ancient Near East from, if you know it from your congregation, and you definitely paint the earliest accounts of like secular evidence for Jesus. You paint them in a way that makes them sound really, really good, but that's not actually. So systematically lie to the cult member, I would say if these are well read and studied leaders, then they are doing that. But if they're just people who've been raised up through the ranks without like seminary or PhDs in like ancient Near Eastern studies, I think it's just kind of like it's built into their communal structures and how they talk about things and how that information is either omitted or they're just ignorant of it.
What was the relationship like between people who had left the group, like former
Oh
members?
gosh. Okay, so minimize or discourage access. So we would use software called Covenant Eyes. And so if you start searching on cults, that would get flagged by Covenant Eyes. And so you would have a discussion with your accountability partner about that, and you could get rebuked for that. But also like that's in a way of like we don't really want you looking at, particular sources of information. Former members specifically, like there's two websites, Xenos is a cult or leavingdwell.com, that are being run, that the leaders are currently in their teachings on their website. You can find this, are saying, don't look up that latest blog post. Don't look up that, opinion piece or news article about, people who are against God, which is what they really mean is people who are against us. Don't really listen to what people who leave us are saying. But to an extent, right, that's built into the scriptures themselves, like 1 John chapter, I believe it's 3, if they left us, they were never really with us, right? And I hear this from Christians who like to claim that I was never really a Christian. When I go into like YouTube debates or open discussion rooms, they're like, oh, he's juvenile, his Bible understanding is trivial, he was never really indwelt by the Holy Spirit, blah, 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 blah. Like he didn't subscribe to my Christianity, so he wasn't really a believer, right? So I can turn him off. I can disregard him.
Yeah. What about controlling of information? Like,
yeah,
was the internet censored? Were you tracked? Did you like?
Yeah, Covenant Eyes will track everything you go to, and give a full report that's viewable by your accountability partner. However, you're still quote unquote free to do that. You're free to engage in that content, but you'll just have to pay the consequences later for doing so.
Covenant Eyes, was that like an app that you installed on your
app.
computer?
You can put it on your phone, your computer.
Okay, and you shared your information with somebody?
You would
okay.
be like, it advises you to have an accountability partner right when you sign up. So you tie someone like your spouse or your discipler or whatever, same-sex person, to evaluate what you're doing on the internet.
So Niddy, we have a question I'm going to throw at you here. What would you say the difference between a religion and a cult is?
So there is a significant amount of overlap here, because there are certain... So let's just try and frame religion in the broadest context that we possibly can, where we say a religion is a set of beliefs that either requires, or maybe it doesn't even require, it's just a set of supernatural or beyond natural beliefs that you can ascribe to at any time in your life and freely accept or reject them. Let's be as generous as possible to the definition of religion. And then that might include what are cultic practices, where this belief is tied to a particular ritual or a particular set of things to say or do, or a way to think about something. And then a cult takes those cultic practices and those beliefs and then instantiates, substantial control or adherence to those things, right? To a point where, there's an inness to that and an outness to that. It's one or the other. It's very black and white after that point. So after you get past the cultic forms of a religion, which is back here in the generous definition, once you get past the cultic generalities of it and you need to be in or out with it, that's when you're starting to dip your toes into cultness, right? Now, culturally, especially in the West, like, we think cult is even one step further than that, right? That there's like some higher stakes to being in or out that are helping drive your decision making and frustrate your life or mental health or your social well-being, on top of all that.
Right.
But the most, I would say, of Western Protestant evangelicalism, or even Catholicism to an extent, is in that second sphere of moderately culty, where like if you renounce Catholicism, then you're just out, right? There is some social costs and things happening there. So you've gone beyond, identifying with like optional practices or things to do or ways to think. And there's an inness and outness that gets you ostracized or has a consequence to it, which makes it just a little culty.
Right. No, that's a good way of putting it. I mean,
I highly recommend a book called Culty, actually, that came out last year. There's an email author on Audible or Amazon. Really great lesson about how language is used and how it can pull us into these kind of like high command groups and ideologies and things like that. It's really good to listen to.
Niddy, you were kind of breaking up a little bit there. Can you tell me the name of that book again?
Cultish.
Cultish. Okay.
Let me try and find it for you.
Yeah.
Really good book, though. I got it with one of my free Audible. Cultish, The Language of Fanaticism by Amanda Montell.
Gotcha. Cultish. I'll put that in the description of this video. All right, so let's go back.
We'll definitely clip that first, those 4 buckets that and I think that was fun.
Gotcha. We'll get a question about Scientology. I don't know if you want to.
Yes.
You want to take that?
Have I jumped on the chair yet? Yes. Totally. But no, I'd say it definitely crosses over between, right? So we have that generous definition of a particular set of beliefs that you can accept or reject at any time, religion, blah. And then you've got, your culticness of it. Like you have your own forms, but those are totally optional, whatever. You've got your in-out group baseline for being cultish. And then you've got your high control manipulation from a central figure with strict adherence to particular practices and thoughts and things like that. And even complete and utter ostracism and dissociation from people on the out group, right? So yes, it goes all the way to that extreme.
Yeah. I think Scientology would hit most of the categories on the Byte model. The United States is one of the few countries that doesn't consider it to be a dangerous group. I mean, it's not recognized as a religion in a lot of European countries, and the reason why it's not is because for the reasons that you just gave. Okay, so let's go back to this.
Let's slam through this Byte model as fast as we can. Sorry. I told you we could go a while on this.
No, I want to get some more of your thoughts. So specifically, because you mentioned this app, I'm curious, was there a lot of I don't know if you want to call it spying or accountability?
Yeah. So between Covenant Eyes and what were the leadership meetings, so the here's what's even more screwed up is what I'd like to call hot reading that happened in the group. So what you would do is you would have your prayer meeting, right? So the 10, 12 most committed people would meet together and say, hey, I'm trying to reach out to this person. Here's what they struggle with. Here's why they don't believe in Jesus. Here's some of their likes and dislikes. And they might come out this week. So, let's pray for them to come. Well, now that person has loaded, 11 and 12 people who that outreach person does not know with a lot of personal details, right? And sometimes very personal details. And so when that person finally shows up, that person is known on a more intimate level by about 10, 11 people than they ever asked for. And any of those people can come up and say, how did this teaching speak to your situation? Playing dumb, but really they have an idea, or the person teaching knows deeply about the person that's now sitting in the chairs in front of them. And so what they've done is oriented some of what the Bible has to say towards that person's life situation to try and bait them into having a reaction to it. Now, the way I'm saying it, here's how we would say it. you need to bring heat in your home church teaching. You have to think deeply and pray about everyone who could be in the seats and think of how the Spirit could communicate to them. So that's how you reframe it to justify the behavior of your hot reading. You're manipulating the data you have of someone's life, finding Bible data, and then saying that's from God to convict them, to change their mind about this, right? It's a shell game, but the person coming has no idea that the person teaching knows all this shit. So in a way, they're spying on non-members in that way, right?
Okay.
They're foisting this information to create a religious experience for the non-member to be more enraptured with what they're saying. And I have a huge issue with that, because they'll do that with people's sexual issues, their familial issues, their financial issues. Everything is open, is fair game, because it's in the name of Jesus and it's what God says. So if it's speaking to that situation in their life, you best believe they're going to put that in the home church teaching to try and draw them in, to show that God really wants to work on their heart. I did that. Yeah. I did that. So I fucked up. Yeah.
How strict? Because you mentioned the app, you mentioned
right.
the small
So
groups.
you have your discipler. So leadership meetings would be like, how's so-and-so doing with porn? You know, and if they were messing up or falling into sin, you'd have to tell your home church leaders, which then, you know, you then trickle that down to an admonishment. And eventually, like, you know, if someone's feeling like they're not sure they want to stick around, you'd be kind of obligated to tell your leadership team, like, hey, this person might leave the church at any moment. What do we want to do about that? And so, yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah. And all that's viewed as, well, we just want to love this person. We don't want to see them abandon their commitment to Jesus. We have a way of framing it to legitimize it and justify the behavior.
Anything else under information control there that you think stands out to you?
Scroll down more. Keep going. Did I lag? Did you lag? Okay, there we go. Unethical use of confession. So yeah, we would have disciplinary groups to remove people from the group. So we withhold forgiveness or give absolution to people based on like some kind of like sin that questions their integrity with the Bible, right? Like they slept with their, you know, fiance or whatever. Like that's almost immediate grounds for removal, and everyone in the community will know about it.
Wow.
And if they don't confess to it and repent and change their ways, they're gone, right?
Okay. That's intense.
It's called church discipline, don't you know? It's 1 Corinthians 5. We're totally on board with that.
This was done publicly? Like
Yeah. You'd gather together the whole church community to get them out. Not like all 500 in the sphere or whatever, but you'd gather together like the 30 people that they were closest to.
Oof. Jeez.
And you do this for like an 18 to 26-year-old. So their brains are still like, you know, fragile to trauma and things like this. And you'd enact this communal shaming event to try and draw them to repentance.
Wow. All right. So let's move on. That's terrible. That's really messed up.
Well, it goes in the emotional control bucket, but.
Right. Jeez.
Yep.
That's traumatizing. Thought control. Were there any thought control techniques that were practiced?
This is something where I think it's kind of both incidental and intentional. So it's like, depending on who you're involved with and how they understand what the Bible is saying, right? So like, what does Jesus say? You're either with me or against me. They're either for us or against us. In 1 John, you're either of the world or of Christ, right? No one by the Spirit of Christ can say Jesus is Lord and worship demons, right? In 1 Corinthians chapter 11 or something like that. So there's the Bible seems to have a clear basis for having black and white thinking, while at the same time your group or whatever, this particular high control group, can also say something like, the Catholics that want you to leave our church, well, they're being deceived by Satan into being deceived by the Pope or something, right? Or into their particular heresy, right? So we would be more than willing to accept that there were Christians definitely outside of us that were heretics or deceived in some particular way. Dwell Community Church in Columbus, Ohio. You're welcome.
Dwell Community Church. Okay.
Mm-hmm. You can go to my channel. I have a playlist called Dear Dwellians that's addressed to them.
Yeah, and Niddy's channel is linked in the description of this video. So black and white thinking, good versus evil type mentality, us versus them, insider,
do not be conformed
outsider
to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, right? The very way that you think is wrong. You need God to reshape your whole brain.
Any use of like insider language?
Yes. So we have, cell group, right? Where it's the men's and women's groups. We have things like that's not my experience. I think that's a thought-stopping technique. That may be your experience, or the church is full of sinners. God has a plan for your suffering. I think that's a thought-stopping technique, but that's, again, something that you could frame within the text of the Bible, right? Buzzwords. What other buzzwords? CT, right? Central teaching. Like we had our own anagrams or things. LTC, leadership training class. Things that might seem rather benign, but that when they get extolled and venerated as important things that you have to attend or are a part of their culture, then yeah, it's, or ministry house, right? Like, what's a ministry house? Well, that's a frat house, but they all love Jesus somewhat and say no homo a lot.
Oh, okay. I'm curious, were there any, it was a Christian group, so I'm guessing there wasn't a whole lot of use of like psychedelics or other mind-altering drugs.
None of that.
What about like spiritual techniques, like emphasis on spiritual experiences through like intensive worship, prayer, speaking in tongues? Did any of that happen?
So here's the interesting thing about this, actually, very recently. So we'd often pride ourselves as, you don't feel that Christianity is true. It just is factually true. So deal with it, right? Kind of facts don't care about your feelings kind of rhetoric, which is common in our culture right now. But so we would be poo-poo to the, hot. You don't want to be stuck on, the mountain of transfiguration with your spiritual high, guys, right? With your chanting, your meditating, your praying, your, speaking in tongues and singing and blah, blah, hallelujah. Like we weren't about that. We were about the God speaking to your mind and your heart in this like deep and esoteric way. So we were poo-poo about all that stuff, but not, I kid you not in the last month and a half, they made public one of their what's called a servant team retreat, which is like where the elders circle jerk each other spiritually and get together and talk about how awesome their church is. And they confessed that the year prior or some years prior at one of these retreats that one of the leaders was speaking in tongues and a prophecy was given over the church, when for decades this group has denounced speaking in tongues as something essential to the Christian experience. So I'm sitting here outside of it like, what the hell is going on? Like, they're changing the tactics. They're, creating this like new dissonance for their members. Like, what? And I don't think anyone in it is paying enough attention to realize that like they're moving the goalpost here, guys. They're starting to bring in this kind of like experiential aspect that they've denounced for decades that is gonna goof around with your own experience of your faith in addition to your own ability to kind of trust them as leaders. But I think a lot of them are just going to go, okay, yeah, wow, that's amazing. And I'm going to be like, guys, where is this coming from? So
Gotcha.
it's just bizarre that it's happening now. And what part of it too, though, is what a better time than, this high accusationary period within the history of their church to have God step in and do something miraculous, right?
Right.
Like in the book of Acts almost.
Anything else from the thought control category
Go
that
to the
stands
bottom
out to you?
again. Oh yeah. So, I mean, I think Christianity in general kind of tries to instill a new map of reality, right? Because if you think about it, right, when you're in Christ, you now are inside of this spiritual man that's in heaven, which how does that even work? Like it creates this immediate dissonance experience in how you evaluate your lived experience and your unlived experience, right? Your unlived experience is being this perfectly peaceful, patient, kind, joyous, forgiving individual who is never angry, lustful, blah, 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 blah. And so now you have to have a like cosmic framework for understanding how your mind and body interact with your lived experience, right? So that's frustrating in and of itself. And on top of that, you also have, right, like that there's these spiritual beings around you that might interfere with your life that you didn't necessarily believe were even there before, right? Or that God himself might be able to intervene and alter your lived experience at any particular moment, right? And I think that's a product of just Christendom in general, not just the group I was a part of. Did they push any political views? You should vote for this candidate. Thankfully, no. Because most of the congregants in this particular group are 50-50. Like it's equally split between Republican and Democrat. And many of the Republicans who are particularly involved in this church, I think, are kind of reluctantly so. Basically, like, this is the lesser of the two abortive babies' evils. Like, I gotta vote this way. I can't help it. Mostly the older people. And then the younger, more progressive people vote Democrat as an opportunity to maintain their religious freedom to be weird and to not be Catholic or some more charismatic goofball form of Christianity.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, Jeff.
Mm-hmm.
What about, and you've kind of already hit on this in a couple
they
of different
overlap
ways.
a little bit. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, emotional control.
Definitely promote feelings of guilt or unworthiness, such as like not living up to your potential, and your affiliations are unwise. Your thoughts or actions are selfish. So I'll go through each one. So not living up to your potential is like, you've already taken this step of faith. I can see you one day leading a home church. Here's what you need to do that, right? I envision this X potential for you with God. Let's see you do that, right? And that's often how we would kind of talk about it and how I would try to lead other young men and say, I'd be like, man, people really listen to you when you come into a room and have something to say. So why don't you keep doing that? Why don't you show Jesus how much what you have to say has to offer, right? And then we'll add a little Bible classes to that and we'll see what happens, right? It's just going to require a little bit more time and sacrifice on your behalf, right? Your affiliations are unwise, so it's kind of framed as like, hey man, I see you're hanging out a lot with people outside the church. Like, are you talking to Jesus with them? Are you talking about how they ought to really be considering what God has to say in their lives? And if you're not, why not? Like, maybe they're influencing you. You gotta be careful about that. And then your thoughts, feelings, and actions are irrelevant or selfish. So this can happen on two levels. One is hey, how can you view that time as gaming as valuable to your mental health, man? Because your relationships in the ministry house are suffering. The more time you spend playing, such and such game to, rest like a normal person, um, uh, you're depriving the members of the body from your insight, from your blah blah blah, from your support or whatever. Or worse, um, well, you remember those group shaming meetings I talked about? The rebukes would sound like this: I can't believe you had sex with your fiance. Do you realize how much that hurts me? How selfish that is of you to do something of your own volition that doesn't require my consent. You know how silly that sounds, but it's like on the outside it sounds silly, but it's like, don't you think about like how you're leading me and what you're teaching me about purity and how selfish it is for you to have sex without me knowing? I mean, how could you do something so evil? Right? It's like, what?
Yeah, that's that's a different level of guilt tripping.
Yeah, man. Yeah, Mark. It sure as fuck is. So thankfully we didn't do too much. Actually, no, I think Christianity number 6. Well, actually, hold on. I think number 5 is pretty important. I'm going to go back here.
Yeah.
So thinking independently, right? Lean not on the Bible says what? The heart is wicked and deceitful above all things. Jeremiah 17:9. Who can understand it, right? Don't trust your own emotional intelligence here. You need to throw all that away. Whatever you're feeling, turn that off, right? The outside world, right? What does Romans 12:2 again say? Don't be conformed to the pattern of this world. Outside voices don't have anything to say about what you're doing for Jesus, right? Your enemies, well, they're all of the devil. Losing one's salvation, well, you can't get too doctrinally far away from how we have interpreted the Bible. Otherwise, you might not be saved. Leaving or being shunned by the group. I mean, come on. That's exactly what I lived through, right? It's like people I built in for a decade with just suddenly become like a one night stand, basically. Like I didn't hear from them for months until they got guilty enough to be like, oh wait, how is he doing?
Oh,
Yeah.
it's terrible.
Yep. So there's that. Love bombing, I think, happens kind of both incidentally and intentionally in the group, where it's kind of like, ooh, new person, let's pay lots of attention to them. And then declaring yourself a horrible sinner. I mean, we would say things like to ourselves or in our prayer lives or prayer meetings, we'd be like, oh, our righteousness is of filthy rags to you, Lord Jesus. Like, we're a menstrual rag. You hate us, but yet you love us, through Jesus Christ and the sacrifice on the cross. So it's kind of like you're directed to perform the highs and lows upon yourself rather than in a group setting. You're taught to think, in both my church and I think in a lot of non-denominational or Protestant type churches overall, maybe even Catholics, I don't know, because I didn't live that experience, but I think it's very easy to bake in getting personal adherence to Christianity to do this to themselves, whether that's through like devotional books or particular prayer meetings and things like that.
Gotcha. And you kind of already mentioned number 7, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Oh man, 8A. So remember what my friend said to me when I was like, not believing? I'm worried you'll be sick until you get to heaven. Right? Like you're never, or it's kind of framed like what we really have here is deep, authentic community and fellowship with one another in Jesus Christ. How could you leave this behind?
Yeah.
Right? So we're trying to bake in through our language that what we're doing here is really from God and everything else is probably not.
Gotcha.
Yep. So the shunning happens kind of as like an incidental thing, right? The less you come, the less you're viewed as spiritual, the less you're viewed as committed to Jesus. Yeah, there's never a legitimate reason to leave. And I found that they're dealing with the YouTube apologetics community, that they'll actually do this too. It's like you never have a justified reason to leave Christianity, right? You can have any um, any justification to become a Christian, but you can almost have no justifications for not being a Christian. There are very few YouTube apologists who will grant you that atheism is even a rational position, right? So when you're trying to convince yourself that you could believe again, you're going to get hit against the break wall of these people who are gatekeeping you, basically, that no matter what kinds of objections you could kind of levy towards God, the Bible, belief in Jesus, nothing will be legitimate enough for you to not accept their conclusions.
So we have a question here from Mark, and maybe we can use this to kind of close us out with. Mark asks, how affected are you now by the manipulation you've described? It loves you, and he's sorry you went through that.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you for coming to my channel the other day. I greatly appreciate it. That was a very fun stream. I got pretty tipsy by the end of it. So go watch that. It was really fun. So how affected am I? At first, it was extremely painful. And I lashed out. I did the very kind of like angry atheist thing, and I posted on Reddit, like, don't come to their Friendsgiving events, blah, blah, blah. And it hurt people's feelings, and they got upset with me for doing that. And now I look back on that, I'm like, that was even kind of nice. Like, but like, I've done a lot of personal healing about this, and I'm trying desperately, and my Twitter's pretty snarky, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's Twitter. Who fuck cares? But if you get to interact with me one-on-one, I try to be very empathetic and understanding of where these people, how these people got to this level of thinking, how that thinking is instilled, how it makes them feel. And I'm just like, I probably would have done the same damn thing, or be doing the same things as the Christians who come on my channel, or I interact with on other channels. If I was in their life situation, given all the data that they're given and the way it's presented and the rewards and the punishments and the financial incentives, especially on YouTube, that they're given to hold these positions, it's like, I don't know how I would necessarily act any different. And especially with, my wife still being in it, and a couple of people that I still deeply care about still in it, I just kind of, there's times where I'm kind of sad and frustrated, but I don't let that frustration take over how I interact with them. I don't let that frustration lead me to say, mean things, or to even, I try my best to not make fun of the things they believe, or make fun of the ways that they talk about their meetings or the things that they do. In fact, I'll just try not to bring it up sometimes. If they want to bring that stuff up, I'm more than happy to talk about it. Or if they ask what I'm up to, right, I'll say, I've been on YouTube, or I've been doing some, social commentary things. They'll be like, oh, how's that going? I'll be like, that's great. And I've had really pretty respectful conversations since then, since some of that healing took place. And I highly recommend. So at the beginning, we said we're not mental health professionals. So for people who listen to this and might think, hey, I'm, getting kind of stuck in some kind of belief structure or a group that might be manipulating me or trying to drive me towards a lifestyle or things that I didn't expect, seek counseling. And not the counseling that the group will recommend to you, but just someone with more letters after their name that went somewhere else that doesn't have to do with the Bible, preferably, or just do like an outpatient program. And I know there's a lot of stigma to that. I know that there's a lot of apprehension that people have towards that, but like, honestly, you're going to meet and interact with people who are both a lot better off and worse off than you. And you're going to see a lot of people from a lot of different life situations that want to connect with you, understand you, give you the emotional support you need to at least get your foot out the door and get you towards resources and people who are willing to listen to you. And I've also found that if you're listening to this, there's people like myself and Michael and Neil the 614 atheist or 604 atheist and Discord servers out there for you at least to vent yourself online, to at least have a digital space to express yourself and be understood and heard and, validated in whatever it is you're going through, you're thinking, you're feeling. You're not alone. There's a lot of people who go through this, and it's just as frustrating and scary for all of them.
Yeah. I appreciate you sharing that, Niddy. And
oh God, Wesley was here.
Yeah, I'm not sure he's mentally well, so we're just not going to have that conversation.
I try to be very aware of that, but yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's ditto to what you said. If anything that Niddy said resonated with you and you're having a hard time, you feel like you're being ostracized, shunned by the group that you belong to, please seek help. Yeah.
Yep. And there's lots of people who want to hear you out and make sure you're doing okay.
Well, thank you, Niddy. This went on a lot longer than I thought it would.
Well, this is a deep topic, and I think it's very warranted to, go long on it.
Right. No, I thought that was super interesting, and I'm sure other people did as well. So thanks again
I hope they did.
Stopping by. Yeah.
Yep.
All right, everyone. Have a good night.
Have a good
I
night.
will see you all later.